In the center of Manhattan stood two towers, rising 110 stories above lower Manhattan. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, 1,168 feet each, the tallest buildings in the world. At least for a few years, they were called the last great project of the Rockefeller Empire, a symbol of American capitalism carved from steel and glass against the sky. But beneath this grandeur hid another story. A story of a destroyed neighborhood. A story of hundreds of small businesses erased from the city map. A story of power that broke the resistance of ordinary people for a vision few shared. This palace was not built on empty ground. It rose on the ruins of what no one was supposed to remember. The war ended in 1945. American servicemen returned home to find a nation transformed. By industrial mobilization and eager to celebrate peacetime prosperity, cities swelled with returning veterans and their young families. The suburbs beckoned with new construction and affordable mortgages. For a brief moment, it seemed the urban core would thrive. Alongside this expansion, Manhattan told a different story. The financial district that had anchored American capitalism for generations began losing what had made it indispensable. Corporate headquarters started relocating to Connecticut in Westchester County during the late 1940s. Executives preferred office campuses with parking lots to cramped buildings accessed by subway. Tax advantages sweetened the move. The exodus accelerated through the 1950s. Companies that had occupied lower Manhattan office space for decades filed change of address forms and departed. Entire buildings stood partially vacant. Property values declined steadily. The tax base that funded city services eroded year by year. New York faced a crisis without precedent as the wealthiest city in the nation. Watched its economic foundation crumble. Lower Manhattan suffered most acutely. The neighborhood south of Chambers Street had been constructed for a 19th century economy. Narrow streets designed for horse-drawn carts couldn't accommodate automobile traffic. Buildings erected in the 1800s lacked modern amenities like central air conditioning and high-speed elevators. Chance. Businesses evaluating renovation costs decided relocation made better financial sense. One neighborhood embodied everything the post-war era was abandoning. Radio Row occupied roughly 13 blocks, bounded by Cortlandt Street, Liberty Street, Church Street, and West Street. The area had evolved organically over 5 decades into the nation's largest electronics district. Hundreds of small shops packed together, creating a marketplace unlike anything else in America. The businesses were modest operations occupying storefronts in aging walk-up buildings, repair shops that fixed radios and televisions, surplus dealers selling military electronics. Leftover from wartime production, component suppliers stocking vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, wire of every gauge. Retailers offering the latest consumer electronics. At competitive prices, most operations were family-owned. Many proprietors were immigrants or first-generation Americans who had built something substantial. From initial investments measured in hundreds rather than thousands of dollars, the physical structures reflected their utilitarian origins. 4- and 5-story buildings constructed cheaply in earlier decades. Storefronts with plate glass windows displayed merchandise. Crammed onto shelves, second floors housed workshops where technicians performed intricate repairs. Upper floors served as storage or modest apartments. Nothing about the architecture suggested permanence or grandeur, but everything functioned exactly as needed. The neighborhood thrived precisely because of this informal density. Electronics enthusiasts. From across the northeastern United States made regular pilgrimages to Radio Row. You could find obscure vacuum tubes that manufacturers had discontinued years earlier. Shopkeepers possessed deep technical knowledge accumulated over decades and would spend time explaining how circuits worked. Students from nearby technical schools browsed for parts to build experimental devices. Engineers from major corporations stopped by to source materials for prototype development. The social fabric proved equally distinctive. Proprietors maintained extensive networks with competitors, relationships built on mutual benefit. They sent customers to shops down the street when they didn't stock what was needed.
Really? That's great.
Information flowed freely between businesses about new products, reliable suppliers, market conditions. Many current owners had started as employees in other Radio Row establishments before saving enough to open their own stores. The community was self-sustaining, self-regulating, and profitable without requiring outside intervention by 1955. Radio Row businesses employed approximately 30,000 people directly. That total included shop owners, skilled technicians, salespeople, delivery workers, administrative staff. Annual sales likely reached tens of millions of dollars, though exact figures were never compiled. The businesses paid property taxes, sales taxes, and payroll taxes that contributed to city revenue at a time when those revenues were declining elsewhere. The neighborhood served functions beyond commerce. Radio Row was a place where technical knowledge was preserved and transmitted between generations through apprenticeship before electronics. Engineering programs became widespread. This neighborhood was where people learned by doing. A teenager interested in radio technology could get hired as a shop assistant and learn the trade through daily exposure to repairs and experienced technicians. That knowledge would support families for generations. None of this impressed the people, making decisions about New York's future, to urban planners and politicians evaluating Lower Manhattan Radio Row, represented exactly what needed to be cleared away. The buildings were old, the streets were congested, the businesses were small scale, the neighborhood generated tax revenue. But didn't project the image of a modern global city. David Rockefeller saw Radio Row differently. He saw opportunity. He saw valuable real estate occupied by businesses. He said, that could be relocated or eliminated. He saw a blank canvas where something transformative could be built. Most importantly, he saw that he possessed the resources and connections necessary to act on that vision. Rockefeller had been born in 1915, the youngest son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., by the time David came of age, that wealth had been diversified into banking, real estate holdings, and philanthropic foundations. The Rockefellers were not merely rich. They were an American institution whose name opened doors that remained closed to ordinary wealthy families. David studied economics at Harvard and earned a doctorate from the University of Chicago. He served briefly in military intelligence during World War II. In 1946, he joined Chase National Bank, which would later merge to become Chase Manhattan. He rose steadily through the ranks. By 1960, he was chairman and chief executive, controlling one of the world's most powerful financial institutions. His office sat in the financial district. He owned substantial real estate throughout Lower Manhattan through family investment vehicles. When property values began declining in the early 1950s, Rockefeller faced a choice. He could accept the deterioration and gradually divest, or he could attempt something far more ambitious. He could try to reverse the decline entirely through massive intervention, requiring government power on unprecedented scale. In 1956, Rockefeller organized the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. The name suggested a broad civic coalition. In reality, it functioned as a private planning group controlled by Rockefeller and a small circle of major property owners whose portfolios would benefit from redevelopment. The association hired urban planners and architects to study the district and propose solutions. The commission's studies reached similar conclusions. Lower Manhattan needed dramatic transformation. The existing building stock was obsolete. Street patterns were inefficient. The neighborhood lacked a signature project that would attract corporate tenants and restore prestige. Small businesses like those in Radio Row couldn't generate the rent revenues needed to justify expensive new construction. What the area required, according to these studies, was wholesale clearance and redevelopment. Entire blocks would need to be acquired, demolished, and replaced with modern office towers. The scale would have to be enormous to make economic sense, and the entity undertaking such a project would need powers that no private developer possessed. Rockefeller identified the mechanism. The Port of New York Authority had been created in 1921. As a bi-state agency jointly controlled by New York and New Jersey, its original mandate involved transportation infrastructure. But the authority possessed extraordinary legal powers. It could condemn property through eminent domain. It could issue bonds backed by future revenues rather than taxpayer guarantees. It was exempt from local zoning regulations. And crucially, it answered to governors, not city councils or mayors. In 1960, David Rockefeller's brother, Nelson, was serving his second term as governor of New York. The Rockefeller family now controlled both the vision for Lower Manhattan's transformation and a significant portion of the political mechanism. The Port Authority had recently completed several major projects and was looking for new opportunities to justify its existence and expand its portfolio. The pieces were falling into place. Downtown Lower Manhattan Association studies had identified the problem. The Port Authority offered the legal and financial tools. The Rockefeller brothers controlled the political will. All that remained was selecting a specific site and developing a proposal, compelling enough to overcome inevitable resistance. Radio Row occupied prime real estate. The 13 blocks sat directly adjacent to the Hudson River waterfront. The location offered potential for spectacular views and easy access to New Jersey via tunnels. The Port Authority already operated, most importantly. The neighborhood could be characterized in ways that would justify its destruction. The businesses were small and individually powerless. The buildings were old and unattractive. The area could be labeled blighted without much public resistance. Few people outside the electronics industry would mourn its loss. And the 30,000 jobs could be dismissed as low value compared to the prestigious corporate employment that new development would supposedly attract by 1960. The Rockefellers had decided. Radio Row would be cleared. In its place would rise something that would restore Lower Manhattan's prestige. And secure the family's downtown real estate investments, the project would be massive enough to transform the entire district. And it would be executed by an authority that small business owners could not effectively challenge in court. The neighborhood was living on borrowed time. The shopkeepers opening their doors each morning had no idea what was coming. Within months, the first public announcements would be made. Within years, wrecking crews would arrive. The community that had built itself over decades would be given months to disappear. The first obstacle was economic reality. Private developers had examined Lower Manhattan and walked away. The financial calculations didn't support investment. Acquiring 13 blocks of property would cost tens of millions before a single building was demolished, environmental remediation, infrastructure upgrades. And foundation work would add tens of millions more. Construction cost for office towers tall enough to make the project viable would reach into the hundreds of millions. Even if a developer could raise that capital, the market wasn't there. Companies were leaving Manhattan for suburban locations, not seeking new urban office space. Convincing corporate tenants to commit to long-term leases in an unfashionable district would be nearly impossible. The financial risk was staggering. No private entity would accept those odds. The city government couldn't help. New York was already running. Substantial budget deficits. Mayor Robert Wagner had no funds for massive real estate development. The city could barely maintain existing infrastructure, much less finance construction of the world's tallest buildings. Municipal bonds might cover smaller projects, but not something on the scale Rockefeller envisioned. That left the Port Authority. The agency had access to capital through its ability to issue revenue bonds backed by bridge and tunnel tolling. It possessed legal powers that transcended normal municipal limitations. And crucially, it had a problem. The Port Authority needed new projects. To justify its existence and maintain its workforce, the agency's traditional mission involved transportation infrastructure connecting New York and New Jersey. By 1960, most major projects in that category had been completed. The George Washington Bridge carried traffic across the Hudson. Tunnels linked Manhattan to New Jersey. Beneath the river, port facilities in both states were modernized without new construction projects. The authority risked becoming irrelevant. Austin Tobin served as executive director of the Port Authority. He had built the agency into a powerful quasi-governmental corporation. During his 2 decades of leadership, Tobin understood that organizations either grow or die. Standing still is not an option. Meant losing talented engineers and administrators to other opportunities. It meant watching political influence erode as elected officials.
Revitalization is not just renewal, but a bold reshaping of our urban destiny. We must embrace this transformation.
A massive construction project that would employ Port Authority staff for years. A prominent development that would enhance the agency's prestige. And a financial structure that could theoretically pay for itself through tenant rents requiring no taxpayer subsidy. Rockefeller and Tobin began serious discussions in 1960. The conversations were private, involving no public announcement or community input. The two men shared an understanding about how large projects happened. You developed the complete plan first, then presented it to the public as inevitable. Soliciting input early only created opportunities for opposition. To organize the political alignment was extraordinary. Nelson Rockefeller, as governor, controlled New York's half of the Port Authority board. New Jersey's governor would need convincing. That could be managed. The project would create thousands of construction jobs in both states. It would generate tax revenue. Political objections could be overcome with the right incentives. By 1961, the basic concept was settled. The Port Authority would build a World Trade Center. In Lower Manhattan, the facility would house offices for international trade organizations and corporations engaged in global commerce. twin towers would serve as the signature elements. Tall enough to reclaim the title of world's tallest buildings from the Empire State Building, the site selection came next. Several locations in Lower Manhattan were evaluated. Each had advantages and disadvantages, but Radio Row kept appearing in the analysis as the optimal choice. The real estate was relatively cheap because the existing buildings were old. The businesses were small and fragmented, meaning no single. Powerful opponent controlled large parcels. The location adjacent to the Hudson offered spectacular views and proximity to Port Authority tunnels. Most importantly, Radio Row could be characterized as blighted. This designation was crucial for legal and public relations purposes. Eminent domain, the government power to seize private property for public use, required demonstrating that the taking served a public purpose, and that the area being cleared was somehow deficient or harmful to the broader community. The definition of blight was elastic. It could mean buildings in structural disrepair. It could mean inadequate sanitation or safety conditions. It could mean an area that generated insufficient tax revenue relative to its potential. Or it could simply mean that planners had decided the current use was not the highest and best use of valuable land. Radio Row buildings were old. That was undeniable. Many dated from the late 19th or early 20th century. They lacked central air conditioning. Elevators were small and slow. Electrical systems had been upgraded over the years, but weren't designed for modern loads by contemporary standards. For Class A office space, the structures were obsolete, but obsolete for office towers didn't mean obsolete for electronics, retail, and repair. The businesses didn't need modern amenities. They needed affordable rent and proximity to each other. The informal clustering that made Radio Row valuable as a marketplace was impossible to recreate in a modern office building where rents would be 10 or 20 times higher. The blight designation ignored this distinction. Studies commissioned by the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association focused on what the buildings lacked, not on whether those lacks mattered for current occupants. The conclusion was predetermined.
This
Radio
project
Row was
delivers
blighted,
immense
therefore
public
clearing
benefit.
it served the
Improved
public
transit,
interest.
jobs,
Therefore,
and
eminent
urban
domain
renewal.
was justified.
We must focus
the business
on the greater
owners had
good.
no warning this was
This
coming.
is progress.
Shopkeepers were focused on inventory, customers, and competition. They paid rent to landlords who owned the buildings. Most operated on modest profit margins. None had the resources or connections to learn what was being planned in closed-door meetings between Rockefeller and Tobin on January 28, 1960. The Port Authority and the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association held a joint press conference.
Monumental
They
day
unveiled
for
plans for a
city.
World Trade Center to be built in Lower Manhattan. The presentation included architectural renderings showing twin towers rising higher than any existing structure. The project would cost an estimated $280 million. It would transform the city's skyline and restore Lower Manhattan's economic vitality. The announcement located the proposed site as the area bounded by Vesey Street, Liberty Street, Church Street, and West Street. Anyone familiar with the neighborhood will recognize this immediately. Radio Row press coverage was generally favorable. The New York Times praised the ambition. Editorial pages celebrated the vision of modern towers replacing decaying blocks. Business sections analyzed the economic impact, predicting thousands of construction jobs and millions in tax revenue. The narrative was progress, modernization, urban renewal. These were the 1960s. Old things made way for new things. That was how cities evolved. Buried in the coverage were brief mentions of the businesses that would be displaced. The Times noted that approximately 800 small shops occupied the site. The number of jobs was reported as several thousand. Though the exact figure was never firmly established, the general tone suggested these were unfortunate casualties of necessary progress. Temporary disruptions that would be offset by greater benefits. The Radio Row business owners learned about the plan from newspapers. No one from the Port Authority or the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had contacted them. No advance notice had been provided. The first indication that their life's work was scheduled for demolition came from reading the morning paper. Oscar Nadell owned a radio parts shop on Cortlandt Street. He had operated there for over 30 years. His father had started the business. Nadell had inherited it, expanded it, raised a family on its income. The shop employed several people. Annual revenue was modest but reliable. The building wasn't much to look at, but the rent was affordable, and the location was perfect for the electronics trade. Nadell read the announcement with growing disbelief. His building was scheduled to be demolished. His business would be forced to relocate. Compensation would be based on property appraisals conducted by the Port Authority, the same organization that wanted to take his property. He would have no choice in the matter. The government had decided his shop was in the way. He called other business owners. Everyone had the same questions. Could the Port Authority actually do this? What were their rights? Could they fight the condemnation? Where would they relocate? How much would they be paid? Who could they contact for answers? The shopkeepers began organizing. They formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association. Nadell became a spokesman. They pooled money to hire lawyers. The legal team reviewed the Port Authority's powers and delivered discouraging news. The agency had broad authority. To condemn property for public purposes, courts historically deferred to government claims that projects served public interests. The blight designation, however, questionable. The lawyers found potential vulnerabilities. The Port Authority's original mandate involved transportation infrastructure, which would be difficult to challenge. Not office building development, could the agency legally claim that luxury office towers constituted a public purpose? Did housing international trade organizations justify seizing private property from American small business owners? These questions might provide grounds for legal action. The business owners also mounted a public relations campaign. They invited reporters to tour Radio Row. Journalists saw functioning stores filled with customers, not blighted decay. They interviewed proprietors who described building their businesses over decades. They documented the community's economic contribution. The narrative began to shift slightly. Maybe this wasn't simply progress replacing obsolescence. Maybe this was powerful interest destroying a viable community for private gain. The Port Authority responded by accelerating its timeline. Delays only gave opposition time to organize and build political support. Tobin pushed for quick approval. From the Port Authority Board, rapid property appraisals and immediate condemnation proceedings, the faster the process moved. The less opportunity existed for effective resistance. By 1962, the battle lines were clear. The Port Authority and Rockefeller interest had the power, the money, and the political connections the Radio Row business owners had. Justice on their side, but little else. They could file lawsuits, hold press conferences, and appeal to elected officials. But they couldn't stop the Port Authority from issuing bonds, couldn't prevent the board from voting approval, and couldn't overcome the legal doctrine. That eminent domain for public purposes was constitutional. The neighborhood had perhaps 5 years before the wrecking crews arrived. The shops remained open, customers still came, but everyone understood the business district was living on borrowed time. The Rockefellers had decided Radio Row's fate. Years earlier, in private meetings, everything that followed was just procedure. The Port Authority needed an architect for the World Trade Center. Not just any architect, but someone whose international reputation would lend prestige to a project already generating controversy. Someone demonstrably capable of designing the tallest buildings in the world. Someone willing to work within the constraints that Tobin and Rockefeller had already established. The choice fell on Minoru Yamasaki. The selection carried layers of irony that apparently escaped notice at the time. Yamasaki was a Japanese American who had spent part of World War II affected by internment policies. Now he was being asked to design the ultimate symbol of American capitalist triumph. On land seized from small business owners through government force, Yamasaki had been born in Seattle in 1912 to immigrant parents who ran a small business. Yes, he studied architecture at the University of Washington, supporting himself through part-time work. After graduation, he moved to New York and found employment with various firms. Working his way up through talent and persistence, despite the discrimination Japanese Americans faced in professional settings with war. Executive Order 6 authorized the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Yamasaki's family was sent to camps. He avoided internment only because he was already living in New York. But the experience marked him profoundly. He had witnessed his parents lose everything they had built because the government decided their presence was inconvenient. By the early 1960s, Yamasaki had established himself as a significant architect. His designs emphasized light, openness, and human scale. He believed buildings should inspire and comfort their occupants, not overwhelm them. His buildings featured delicate details, natural materials, and careful attention to how people would actually use spaces. The World Trade Center Commission required him to abandon most of these principles. The program was predetermined: 2 towers of 110 stories each, floor plates large enough to accommodate massive office layouts, exterior walls that would support the structural load, eliminating the need for interior columns. The scale alone contradicted everything Yamasaki believed about humane architecture. He accepted the commission anyway. The reason was simple: this was the largest architectural project in the world. Turning it down would have been professional suicide. Whatever reservations he had about the scale or the circumstances could be rationalized. Every architect made compromises. This was simply a larger compromise for a larger fee. Yamasaki's design emerged from engineering constraints as much as aesthetic vision. Buildings of this height faced enormous wind loads. Traditional steel frame construction. With exterior curtain walls wouldn't work. The walls themselves would need to carry structural loads, creating a tube that resisted lateral forces. The solution was a facade of closely spaced vertical aluminum columns. Each column was 18 inches wide. They were positioned just 22 inches apart, creating a dense vertical rhythm that made the towers look like they were wrapped in metal fabric. The narrow window spacing was an engineering necessity. But Yamasaki claimed it also served a psychological purpose. He was allegedly afraid of heights. The closely spaced columns made the windows feel smaller and less vertiginous. The windows themselves couldn't open. This was standard for modern office towers. Where climate control required sealed environments, but the decision had consequences. Occupants would have no fresh air, no control over their immediate environment. They would work in hermetically sealed boxes, entirely dependent on mechanical systems for comfort and survival. Yamasaki designed other elements to humanize the scale. The towers would rise from a plaza elevated above street level. The plaza would feature sculpture, fountains, and trees. The ground floors would include restaurants and shops, creating public gathering spaces. The lobby design emphasized light and openness, with soaring ceilings, that would make visitors feel they were entering somewhere significant. These gestures couldn't overcome the fundamental inhumanity of the program. The towers would house 50,000 workers in each building. That density was unprecedented. The elevators alone required extraordinary innovation. Traditional elevator systems couldn't serve 110 floors. Efficiently, Yamasaki and the engineering team developed a sky lobby system. Express elevators would carry passengers to lobbies. On the 44th and 78th floors, where they would transfer to local elevators serving specific floor ranges, the engineering was brilliant. The human experience would be alienating. Workers would spend their days in identical floors stacked one atop another. They would have no control over temperature or air quality. They would be utterly dependent on elevators for entry and exit if anything went wrong with the building systems. Thousands of people would be trapped. Yamasaki never publicly acknowledged these contradictions. Interviews featured him discussing the aesthetic, refinements, the careful proportions, the play of light on aluminum surfaces. He presented the towers as a humanist achievement, a celebration of international cooperation and commerce. The promotional materials showed well-dressed executives working in pleasant offices with dramatic views. The reality that the buildings were being constructed on land seized from unwilling sellers went unmentioned. The Port Authority's publicity materials made no reference to Radio Row. The narrative was progress and modernity, not displacement and destruction. Yamasaki participated in this selective storytelling. Perhaps he had no choice. Perhaps he genuinely believed the towers served a greater good that justified the means, while Yamasaki refined his designs. The legal battle over Radio Row intensified. The business owners filed suit in 1962, challenging the Port Authority's right to condemn their property. Their lawyers argued that building luxury office towers did not constitute a public purpose as required by eminent domain law. The Port Authority countered that. The World Trade Center would serve public functions. It would house international trade organizations. It would provide offices for government agencies. The facility would promote commerce and economic development benefiting the entire region. These public purposes justified the property seizures. The case reached the New York Court of Appeals in March of 1963. The court ruled in favor of the Port Authority. The judges accepted the agency's argument that promoting international trade served a legitimate public interest. The blight designation for Radio Row was not seriously challenged. The business owner's fundamental objection that the government was taking private property to benefit other private interests was dismissed. The ruling was devastating. It removed the last legal barrier to condemnation. The Port Authority could now begin property appraisals and force sales. The shopkeepers had lost their strongest weapon. Court appeals were exhausted. They had no political allies. Powerful enough to intervene, David Rockefeller and Austin Tobin had won. The appraisal process began immediately. Port Authority assessors toured Radio Row, properties examining buildings and businesses. They calculated values based on structures, land, and projected business income. The methodology systematically undervalued what the owners were losing. A building purchased decades earlier for $20,000 might be appraised at $30,000, reflecting land appreciation. But ignoring inflation or replacement costs, business goodwill, the intangible value of customer relationships and location was given minimal weight. The cost of relocating inventory, finding new space, and rebuilding clientele was barely considered. Oscar Nadel's radio shop was appraised. And a fraction of what he believed it was worth, the assessors looked at his lease, his inventory, his customer base. They calculated what they claimed was fair market value. Nadel knew the number was absurd. His business generated enough income to support his family and employees. Moving it would cost far more than the compensation offered. Starting over at age 60 was not a realistic option. Hundreds of other owners received similar news. The compensation was inadequate. The timeline was compressed. They would be forced to sell and vacate within months. Some owners were elderly. They had planned to operate their businesses for a few more years, then retire on the proceeds from selling to someone else. The Port Authority was offering them a fraction of what willing buyers might have paid. The business owners tried negotiating. They requested higher appraisals, longer timelines, relocation assistance. The Port Authority made minimal adjustments. Tobin wanted the site cleared and construction started. Delay only risked renewed opposition or political complications. The faster Radio Row disappeared, the sooner the World Trade Center could rise in its place. By 1964, some owners began accepting settlements. They had no choice. Legal avenues were exhausted. Political pressure had failed. Continued resistance would only mean losing their businesses. With even less compensation, the first shops began closing, going out of business sales, liquidated inventory. Proprietors who had spent decades building something were reduced to selling it off at pennies on the dollar. The community started fragmenting. Some owners relocated to other parts of the city. The electronics cluster that made Radio Row valuable couldn't be recreated elsewhere. Shops scattered across different neighborhoods lost the advantage of proximity. Customers who could walk from store to store comparing prices and components now had to travel across the city. The ecosystem was being destroyed. Other owners simply retired. They took their inadequate compensation and gave up finding new locations, negotiating leases, rebuilding customer bases. The effort seemed insurmountable, especially for older proprietors who had already invested decades. They closed their shops, took what the Port Authority offered, and tried to make peace with the loss. A few held out. They refused settlements and forced the Port Authority to take legal action. Condemnation proceedings dragged through courts. These owners knew they would ultimately lose, but wanted to impose maximum delay and cost on the project. If they couldn't save Radio Row, they could at least make the Rockefellers and Tobin pay for destroying it. The media coverage dwindled. Early stories about the David versus Goliath legal battle gave way to construction updates. Newspapers that had briefly covered the shopkeepers' plight moved on to other stories. Radio Row was becoming history. The World Trade Center was the future. Readers wanted to know about the towers, not about the businesses being cleared away to build them. By 1965, the outcome was certain. Demolition would begin within months. Radio Row would cease to exist, and Minoru Yamasaki's towers would rise on ground cleared through government power. Wielded on behalf of private interests, the wrecking crews arrived in March of 1966. Demolition of Radio Row began on the east side of the district. Working systematically westward toward the Hudson River, the Port Authority wanted the site cleared as quickly as possible. Every month of delay meant continued cost and political risk. The first buildings to fall were the smallest and oldest. Crews broke through roofs, knocked down walls, hauled away debris. Dump trucks lined the streets carrying rubble to landfills in New Jersey. The work proceeded with industrial efficiency. Buildings that had stood for 70 or 80 years disappeared in days. Shop owners who had already vacated watched from across the street. Some came to witness the destruction of places where they had spent decades. Others stayed away, unable to bear seeing it. The photographs from that spring show men in suits standing on sidewalks, staring at piles of brick and splintered wood that had been their businesses. Not everyone had left. A handful of proprietors refused to accept the settlements or acknowledge the condemnation orders. They remained in their shops serving customers, maintaining the fiction that normal business could continue. The Port Authority obtained court orders authorizing physical removal. City marshals arrived with eviction notices. The holdouts were escorted from their buildings. Their possessions moved to the street. Oscar Nadel was among the last to go. He had operated his radio shop for 33 years. Every component on his shelves represented knowledge about suppliers. Manufacturers and customer needs walking away meant abandoning that accumulated expertise. But on a morning in April of 1966, marshals knocked on his door and told him he had 2 hours to remove what he could carry. Nadeau filled boxes with inventory. He left most of it behind. There was no time to pack everything, no place to store it all. The business he had inherited from his father and built into something sustainable was reduced to whatever fit in his car. He drove away as demolition crews prepared to tear down the building. Within a week, the structure was rubble. The human cost extended beyond the 800 business owners. Each shop had employed people, technicians who repaired radios and televisions, salespeople who helped customers find components, delivery drivers who moved inventory, office staff who managed paperwork. Conservative estimates suggested 30,000 jobs were directly tied to Radio Row businesses. Most of those employees were not compensated. The Port Authority paid settlements to property owners and primary business operators. Workers who had spent years or decades employed in Radio Row shops received nothing. They lost their jobs when their employers were forced out. They had to find new work in an economy that was already shedding manufacturing and technical jobs. Some employees followed their employers to new locations, but relocated businesses operated on tighter margins with higher rents. They couldn't afford the same staff levels. Workers who had been fully employed found themselves with reduced hours or no position at all. The ripple effects spread through families and communities. Mortgages couldn't be paid. Children's education plans were disrupted. Retirements were delayed or abandoned. The African American and immigrant communities that had found economic footing through Radio Row were hit particularly hard. The neighborhood had been one of the few places where technical skills mattered. More than surname or skin color, shop owners hired based on ability to repair electronics or knowledge of components. The electronics district had provided economic mobility for people who faced discrimination
Và sau đó nó sẽ phát ra tín hiệu ở đây ạ.
was removed.
Đúng rồi, chính
Scattered
xác.
businesses that
Cảm ơn
relocated
thầy,
to other parts
giờ
of
con đã hiểu
Manhattan
rồi ạ.
or to outer boroughs couldn't recreate the clustering effect, the knowledge ecosystem that allowed a young technician to move from shop to shop, learning different specializations and building a reputation no longer existed. Those opportunities disappeared with the neighborhood. The demolition accelerated through summer and fall of 1966. Entire blocks vanished. The streetscape transformed from dense commercial buildings to open lots filled with debris. Dust hung in the air constantly. Noise from jackhammers and falling masonry echoed through lower Manhattan. The neighborhood surrounding the demolition zone endured months of disruption. By December, most of the structures were gone. 13 blocks that had contained hundreds of buildings now stood empty except for piles of brick, concrete, and twisted metal. Salvage crews picked through the wreckage. Recovering anything valuable, steel beams were cut apart and sold for scrap. Architectural details that might have been preserved in other circumstances were destroyed or lost. The Port Authority conducted no archaeological survey, no systematic documentation of the buildings was undertaken. A few photographers captured images of the demolition, but no comprehensive record exists of what Radio Row looked like in its final years. The neighborhood was erased from the physical landscape and nearly erased from memory. Contemporary news coverage focused on the construction project beginning, not the community that was ending. Articles described the ambitious engineering required to build the world's tallest towers. They profiled Minoru Yamasaki and his design vision. They explained the innovative structural system and elevator configuration. Radio Row appeared only as a necessary clearing operation. If it was mentioned at all, the site clearance created an unexpected problem. The debris from 800 demolished buildings exceeded initial estimates. Hauling it all to New Jersey landfills would cost millions and take months. The Port Authority needed a faster solution. They decided to dump the rubble into the Hudson River. The demolished remains of Radio Row were pushed into the water along the western edge of the construction site. Brick, concrete, wood, glass. All of it went into the river. The dumping created approximately 23 acres of new landfill, extending Manhattan's shoreline westward. Battery Park City would eventually be built on this land. The neighborhood destroyed to build the World Trade Center literally became the foundation for another development. Environmental regulations that would later prohibit such dumping didn't exist in the 1960s. The Port Authority faced no legal obstacles. Critics raised concerns about water quality and marine life, but their objections carried little weight. Progress required expediency. The rubble had to go somewhere. The river was convenient. By early 1967, the site was clear. 13 blocks of Lower Manhattan stood empty, ready for excavation and construction. The businesses were gone. The buildings were demolished. The community was scattered. Radio Row existed only in the memories of people who had worked there and in the file cabinets of lawyers. Who had unsuccessfully fought the condemnation, David Rockefeller never publicly addressed what had been done to make the World Trade Center possible. He gave no interviews acknowledging the neighborhood that was destroyed. His public statements focused on urban renewal, economic revitalization, and New York's future as a global city. The human cost was not mentioned. Austin Tobin similarly avoided the topic. Port Authority press releases celebrated the beginning of construction on the world's largest building project. They highlighted the engineering challenges ahead, the jobs that would be created, and the prestige the towers would bring. The fact that the site had recently been occupied by 800 functioning businesses was treated as an irrelevant historical detail. Minoru Yamasaki participated in this silence. His interviews and writings about the World Trade Center never mentioned Radio Row. He discussed his design philosophy, his concern for human scale, his hope that the buildings would inspire and uplift. He said nothing about the people, whose displacement made his towers possible. The cleared site now waited for the next phase. Excavation would have to reach bedrock 70 feet below street level. Engineers would have to solve the problem of building foundations while preventing the Hudson River from flooding the pit. Construction would require innovations in materials, techniques, and safety procedures. The project would take years and cost far more than initial estimates. But those were technical problems. Difficult, certainly, but solvable with enough money and expertise. The moral problem, whether seizing private property. From hundreds of small business owners to build luxury office towers, served any legitimate public purpose was never seriously debated. The courts had ruled the demolition was complete. The questions that should have been asked were buried under rubble at the bottom of the Hudson River. Excavation began in August of 1966, even before demolition was complete. The foundation would be the most technically challenging part. Of the entire project, the towers needed to reach bedrock 70 feet below street level, but bedrock in Lower Manhattan sits beneath layers of soil and fill that had accumulated over centuries, and just 300 feet to the west flowed the Hudson River. Traditional excavation methods wouldn't work. Digging a massive pit that close to the river would allow water to seep through the soil and flood the site. The excavation would become an artificial lake. Engineers needed a way to dig down while simultaneously preventing water infiltration. The solution was a slurry wall. The technique had been used in Europe, but never on this scale in the United States. Crews would dig a trench around the perimeter of the site, filling it with a mixture of water and bentonite clay. As they went, the slurry would be dense enough to prevent the trench walls from collapsing.
Can we fight the condemnation?
Once the trench reached bedrock, workers would lower steel, reinforcement cages into the slurry, and pump in concrete. As the concrete displaced the slurry, it would create a permanent underground wall. Anchored in bedrock, the wall would be 3 feet thick and extend 70 feet down. It would form a waterproof barrier around the entire 16-acre site. Once complete, Costa Rica once Creosote crews could safely excavate the interior, pumping out groundwater and digging down to bedrock. The slurry wall would both hold back the Hudson River and eventually form part of the permanent foundation structure.
It's certainly busy.
Construction of the slurry wall began in early 1967. Specialized equipment was brought from Europe. Workers excavated the perimeter trench in sections, each about 20 feet long. The work was slow and precise. Any mistake could compromise the wall's integrity and doom the entire project. The excavation itself removed an astonishing volume of earth. Approximately 1.2 million cubic yards of soil and rock had to be hauled away.
Strike while we have the chance.
That material, like the demolished buildings before it went into the Hudson River to create landfill, day after day, trucks carried loads from the pit to the waterfront, where bulldozers pushed it into the water. By late 1968, the excavation was complete. The site now consisted of a massive pit surrounded by slurry walls. Bedrock was exposed across 16 acres. The foundation could begin. Workers started pouring concrete for the base that would support the towers. The foundation alone required tens of thousands of cubic yards of concrete. Steel fabrication had been underway for months at mills in the Pacific Northwest. The structural design called for a new approach. Traditional skyscrapers used steel frame construction, with columns distributed throughout the building. The World Trade Center would instead use a tube structure. Closely spaced steel columns on the exterior walls would carry most of the structural load, allowing column-free floor space inside. Each tower would have 240 exterior columns. The columns were fabricated as prefabricated units with 3 columns joined together, spanning 3 floors. These units weighed approximately 22 tons each. They were shipped by rail from the West Coast, a journey that took weeks. Coordination was critical. The first steel went up in August of 1968 for Tower 1, the North Tower. Ironworkers guided the massive column units into place, bolting them to the foundation. And to each other, the exterior began taking shape, the dense vertical rhythm of columns that Yamasaki had designed becoming visible. Tower 2, the South Tower, began rising 6 months later. The Port Authority had decided to stagger construction to spread out costs and allow lessons learned from the first tower to inform work on the second. The work was dangerous. Ironworkers operated at extreme heights. In all weather conditions, wind was a constant hazard. Manhattan's position at the confluence of rivers created unpredictable gusts. Safety equipment was primitive by later standards. Falls were common. The first fatality occurred in January of 1970. Carl Koch, an iron worker, fell from the 44th floor. He was 36 years old and left behind a wife and children. The Port Authority issued statements about safety protocols. Work continued the next day. More deaths would follow before construction was complete. The exact number of fatalities remains disputed. Port Authority records acknowledge some deaths, but likely undercounted workers who died from injuries sustained on site, but who passed away days later in hospitals may not have been included. Estimates range from 6 to over a dozen workers killed during construction. Each death represented a family destroyed. The victims were skilled tradesmen, doing dangerous work for wages that barely supported middle-class lives. They built the towers that would make the Rockefellers and Port Authority commissioners proud. And they paid for that achievement with their lives. The construction proceeded relentlessly. By 1970, both towers were rising above the Manhattan skyline. Their height became apparent as they surpassed neighboring buildings. When they reached 80 stories, they were taller than everything in Lower Manhattan. Except each other, cost overruns began almost immediately. The initial estimate of $280 million proved wildly optimistic. Foundation challenges cost more than anticipated. Steel prices increased. Labor costs exceeded projections. The innovative structural system required custom engineering at every stage. Adding expenses that standard construction wouldn't have incurred by 1971, the projected total cost had risen to approximately $600 million. By completion, it would exceed $900 million. The Port Authority could absorb these overruns by issuing additional bonds backed by bridge and tunnel revenues. But the escalating price tag created political problems. Austin Tobin defended the project by emphasizing the public benefits. The World Trade Center would house international trade organizations promoting commerce. It would provide offices for government agencies. The observation deck would attract tourists. These public functions justified the expense. The fact that the vast majority of space would be rented to private corporations at market rates was downplayed. The construction timeline also slipped. The original plan called for completion by 1972. Delays pushed this to 1973. Weather, labor disputes, and the sheer complexity of building structures this tall all contributed. The first tenant moved into the North Tower in December of 1970. The Port Authority itself took space, becoming its own first occupant. This was both practical and symbolic, but it also revealed an uncomfortable truth. Outside tenants were not rushing to sign leases. The South Tower topped out in July of 1971, reaching its full 110 stories. The North Tower had topped out a few months earlier. The two towers now stood as the tallest buildings in the world, each rising 1,168 feet above street level. They had surpassed the Empire State Building. The official dedication ceremony took place on April 4, 1973. Dignitaries gathered to celebrate the completion of the largest construction project. In New York history, Governor Rockefeller spoke. Port Authority commissioners gave speeches about vision and achievement. Minoru Yamasaki attended. The narrative was triumph. Radio Row was not mentioned. The 800 businesses destroyed to clear the site were absent from the speeches. The 30,000 jobs lost received no acknowledgement. The families whose lives had been disrupted so the towers could rise were invisible at the celebration. History had been edited to remove the uncomfortable parts, but the towers themselves were about to reveal an uncomfortable truth. They were complete. They were the tallest in the world, and almost nobody wanted to rent space in them. The World Trade Center opened with a fundamental problem. The towers contained approximately 10 million square feet of office space that was more than existed in many entire cities. Finding enough tenants to fill that space in a market already oversupplied would be difficult. Finding tenants willing to pay premium rents for an unfashionable address would be nearly impossible. Lower Manhattan in the early 1970s was not where prestigious corporations wanted to be. Midtown had become the center of corporate New York. Park Avenue, 6th Avenue, Madison Avenue. These were the addresses that conveyed status, banks, law firms, and major corporations clustered in Midtown because that's where their competitors and clients were located. The World Trade Center had a second problem. The location was isolated. Subway access was limited compared to Midtown. The neighborhood shut down after business hours. There were few restaurants, no cultural attractions, minimal retail. Employees who worked in the towers would spend their days in a business district that felt dead once the markets closed. The Port Authority had commissioned studies predicting strong demand from companies involved in international trade. These projections proved wildly optimistic. Corporations engaged in global commerce saw no particular advantage to being in a building called the World Trade Center.
By manufacturing
They needed good
demand.
telecommunications, convenient transportation, and proximity to partners. A lower Manhattan address offered none of these advantages. By mid-1973, occupancy rates were dismal. The Port Authority itself occupied substantial space, effectively renting from itself to avoid the embarrassment of completely empty floors. The New York State government leased multiple floors, a favor arranged by Governor Rockefeller. These government tenants accounted for a significant portion of occupied space. Private sector leasing was catastrophic. Major corporations showed no interest. The buildings that were supposed to restore Lower Manhattan's prestige were being rejected by the very companies they were meant to attract. Real estate brokers struggled to book tours. The financial implications were severe. The Port Authority had borrowed nearly $900 million to build the towers. That debt needed to be serviced through rental income, but with occupancy below 50% and climbing slowly. Rental revenues fell far short of debt payments. The authority was covering shortfalls by diverting money from bridge and tunnel operations. This created political problems. The Port Authority was supposed to be self-sustaining. Bridge and tunnel tolls paid for bridge and tunnel maintenance, using those funds to subsidize empty office towers. Violated the implicit compact with toll payers. Commuters were effectively subsidizing David Rockefeller's failed real estate speculation. Critics began calling the towers Rockefeller's folly. Architectural publications questioned Yamasaki's design. The closely spaced columns were described as oppressive. The sealed windows and dependence on mechanical ventilation made the buildings feel like vertical coffins. The plaza was windswept and unwelcoming. People avoided it. The observation deck on the South Tower's 110th floor opened in December of 1973. This provided one clear success. Tourists came in enormous numbers. The views were spectacular. The deck generated substantial revenue and created positive publicity, but tourist dollars couldn't make up for empty office floors. The Port Authority needed corporate tenants paying long-term rents. Those tenants weren't materializing. Marketing efforts intensified. Brokers offered concessions and reduced rates. Major companies still declined. The broader economic context was deteriorating. The 1973 oil crisis sent energy prices soaring and triggered a recession. Corporations cut costs and deferred expansion plans. The last thing they wanted was expensive new office space in an inconvenient location. New York City itself was sliding toward fiscal catastrophe. Years of deficit spending, declining tax revenues, and generous union contracts had created an unsustainable financial situation. By 1975, the city was effectively bankrupted. Banks refused to extend additional credit. The near collapse of New York became a national crisis. President Ford initially refused federal assistance. Eventually, emergency loans were arranged, but the city entered a period of brutal austerity. Services were cut, employees were laid off. Infrastructure maintenance was deferred. Crime increased. This environment did nothing to help. World Trade Center leasing companies weren't expanding in New York. They were leaving the suburban migration that had started in the 1950s. Accelerated, the towers stood as monuments to a vision of urban renewal. That the market was rejecting David Rockefeller's personal reputation suffered. He had championed the World Trade Center as the solution to lower Manhattan's decline. Instead, it had consumed $900 million, destroyed a functioning business community, and produced half-empty office towers that were draining Port Authority resources. Rockefeller continued leading Chase Manhattan Bank, but his influence in New York civic affairs diminished. The failure of the World Trade Center to achieve its stated objectives undermined his credibility. Critics who had opposed the Radio Row demolition felt vindicated. They had warned that destroying a viable community. To build speculative office towers was bad policy. The towers presented maintenance problems. Climate control consumed enormous energy. Elevator systems required constant monitoring. Cleaning 10 million square feet was a full-time job for hundreds of workers. With occupancy below 50%, rental income couldn't cover operating expenses, much less debt service, gradually. Reluctantly, the market shifted. By the late 1970s, occupancy began climbing, not through major corporate tenants, but through smaller firms that needed space, and found the reduced rents attractive. Government agencies expanded their presence. Financial services firms that couldn't afford midtown addresses took floors in the World Trade Center.
To our
the
continued
buildings
success
were finally
and
filling,
to the
though
empire
not
below,
with the prestigious
a toast to
international
power
trade organizations
and to our vision.
that had justified the project. The tenants were ordinary businesses making pragmatic decisions about real estate costs. But they signed leases, they paid rent, and they kept the towers from being a complete financial disaster. By 1980, occupancy had reached approximately 75%. The Port Authority was still subsidizing operations through bridge and tunnel revenues, but the losses had decreased. Optimists suggested the towers might eventually break even. The observation deck continued attracting tourists. The towers had become a recognizable element of the New York skyline. Photographers included them in cityscape shots. Films set in New York featured them prominently. Popular culture was slowly transforming the towers from Rockefeller's folly into an accepted part of the urban landscape. But acceptance wasn't redemption. The towers existed because 800 small businesses had been destroyed. They were built with money, borrowed against future revenues that took a decade to materialize. The vision of Lower Manhattan renewal through prestige development had largely failed. Corporate headquarters continued clustering in Midtown. The Rockefeller family never publicly acknowledged these failures. Or the methods used to make the project possible. David Rockefeller's memoirs, published decades later, would defend the World Trade Center as a successful urban renewal effort. The destroyed businesses, the displaced workers, the years of financial losses, all of it would be minimized or omitted. The towers were standing, they were filling, and they were beginning to serve a function nobody had anticipated. They were becoming symbols. The 1970s gave way to the 80s. The towers that had opened to mockery and empty floors were becoming woven into the fabric of New York, not through careful planning or brilliant marketing, but through simple presence. They were there. They were enormous. And gradually, people stopped seeing them as Rockefeller's mistake and started accepting them as part of the skyline. The observation deck became one of the city's premier tourist destinations. 2 million visitors annually rode elevators to the 107th floor of the South Tower. They paid admission to stand at windows on the world. The restaurant on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower. The views justified the expense. From that height, Manhattan revealed its geography. In ways street level never could, photography played a crucial role in the tower's transformation. Images of the Twin Towers appeared on postcards. In guidebooks, in films, directors shooting establishing its shots of New York included them automatically. The towers became visual shorthand for the city itself. When people around the world thought of New York, they increasingly pictured those two rectangular monoliths. The 1976 remake of King Kong used the towers as its climax. The giant ape climbed the South Tower, while helicopters circled the sequence, embedded the buildings in popular culture in ways no amount of Port Authority publicity could have achieved. By the mid-1980s, occupancy had reached 90%. The Port Authority was finally collecting enough rent to cover operating expenses. And debt service, the financial disaster of the opening years, had been overcome through persistence and market adjustment. Rents had been lowered to competitive levels. The tenant mix reflected this reality. Financial services firms occupied multiple floors, law offices. Serving the financial industry, clustered nearby government agencies, continued leasing space. The international trade organizations that were supposed to anchor the complex were present but not dominant. The towers were functioning as ordinary office buildings. The plaza between the towers developed its own rhythms. Office workers took lunch breaks there in decent weather. Street performers worked the crowds. The sculpture by Fritz Koenig, a large bronze sphere in the center, became a meeting point. The space was still windswept and austere, but it was being used. Windows on the world attracted a different clientele. The restaurant served expensive meals with spectacular views. Business executives brought clients. Tourists celebrated special occasions. The setting was unique. Sitting at a table on the 107th floor while the city sprawled below created an experience that justified the prices. The towers had also become a symbol of American capitalism in ways that complicated their meaning to admirers. They represented ambition, achievement, and economic power. United States could build structures taller than anywhere else. The towers were proof of what private enterprise and government cooperation could accomplish. Critics saw something different. They saw monuments to corporate excess, built on the destruction of small businesses. They saw evidence that government power could be wielded to benefit the wealthy at the expense of ordinary people. Radio Row had been erased from physical existence. But the moral questions had not disappeared in February of 1993. Those questions became irrelevant in the face of violence. A truck bomb exploded in the underground parking garage. Beneath the North Tower, the blast killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. Smoke filled the building. 50,000 workers evacuated down darkened stairwells. The bombing exposed vulnerabilities nobody had seriously considered. The towers were targets. Their symbolic status made them attractive. To anyone wanting to strike at America, the height that made them spectacular also made evacuation difficult, getting tens of thousands of people down 100 floors. Took hours. Security was enhanced after the attack. Vehicle access was restricted. Barriers were installed. The Port Authority spent millions hardening the complex. Experts assured the public that the towers were now safe. Life returned to normal. The 1990s brought peak success to the World Trade Center. Occupancy remained above 90%. Rental income was strong. The observation deck and windows on the world were profitable. The Port Authority had finally achieved the vision. Even if it had taken 2 decades longer than anticipated, the towers had become beloved by many New Yorkers, despite their controversial origins. Workers who spent their days in those buildings developed attachment to them. The views were extraordinary. The towers had become familiar. They were part of people's daily lives. The skyline itself had changed around the towers. Other buildings had risen, but none approached their height. They remained dominant, visible from miles away. Approaching Manhattan, you saw them first. They announced the city. By 2000, the World Trade Center had been standing for 27 years. An entire generation had grown up knowing those towers as permanent features. Children born after the towers opened had no memory of the neighborhood that preceded them. Radio Row existed only in archives and in the fading memories of people who had worked there. The Rockefeller family's role had receded from public consciousness. David Rockefeller was in his 80s. His brother Nelson had died in 1979. The Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had dissolved. The mechanisms that had cleared Radio Row belonged to history. The Port Authority continued operating the complex. Annual revenues exceeded $100 million. The buildings required constant maintenance, but they were finally profitable. The debt incurred during construction had been refinanced at lower rates. Minoru Yamasaki died in 1986. His towers had become his most famous work, though critics argued. They represented a betrayal of his humanist principles. Yamasaki had never publicly addressed the contradiction. The towers stood as his legacy. September 11th, 2001 was a clear morning. 50,000 people went to work in the towers at 8:46 American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower 17 minutes later. United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59. The North Tower fell at 10:28. 2,753 people died. The buildings that took 7 years to construct were gone in less than 2 hours. The attacks transformed the towers from controversial office buildings into sacred ground. The neighborhood destroyed to build them was forgotten entirely. The inadequate compensation paid to Radio Row business owners The footprints where the towers had stood were preserved as reflecting pools. Names of the dead were inscribed on bronze panels. Visitors came to mourn, to remember. To pay respects, One World Trade Center, built on part of the original site, opened in 2014. It rises 1,776 feet taller than the Twin Towers. The building is designed to be resilient against attacks. Radio Row is not mentioned in any of the memorial materials. The 800 businesses destroyed to clear the site have no plaque, no acknowledgement. Oscar Nadell and the other shop owners who lost their life's work are absent from the historical narrative. David Rockefeller died in 2017 at age 101. Obituaries praised his philanthropy and business leadership. The World Trade Center was mentioned as one of his major achievements. The methods used to make it possible were not discussed. The question that Radio Row business owners raised in the 1960s remains unanswered. Does government have the right to seize private property from functioning businesses to build speculative real estate for other private interests? The courts said yes. The towers rose, but whether that legal authority should have been exercised is different from whether it could be. The towers stood for 28 years in that time. They evolved from failure to fixture to symbol. They became beloved despite their origins. The destruction on September 11th sanctified them in ways their builders never anticipated. The dark story of how they came to be was buried beneath a narrative of loss and remembrance. The Rockefeller empire that built them is gone. The neighborhood they replaced has been forgotten. The towers themselves exist now only in photographs and memories and in the reflecting pools where they once stood. What remains are questions about power, about who decides what cities become, and about whether magnificence can ever justify the means used to achieve it.